You changed the relationship. And for a real while, it felt like something had finally shifted. Then you changed the job. The city, maybe. The friendships. The way you talked about yourself. The version of your life you showed people. And somewhere in the middle of all that changing, you noticed something. The feeling came back. Not immediately. Not obviously. It crept in the way it always does. Slow, quiet, uninvited. That specific weight. That specific sense that something just below the surface is still not right. And the thought that followed was one you've probably never said out loud. What is wrong with me? Because you did everything. You really did. You didn't sit still and wait for things to change. You moved. You made the hard choices. You showed up for yourself when it would have been easier not to. You read the books, had the conversations, made the changes that people who love you called brave. And the feeling came back anyway. I want to say something clearly before we go any further. Nothing is wrong with you, but you have been solving the wrong problem. And that distinction is what changes everything. Dr. Albert Bandura spent decades at Stanford studying why some people change and others don't, even when they're working just as hard, trying just as consistently, wanting it just as much. What he found wasn't about motivation. It wasn't about discipline. It wasn't about how much you want something. It was about what you believe is actually changeable. He called it self-efficacy, but not in the general sense most people use that word. He meant something very specific. The belief that the right thing is being addressed, that the effort is pointed at the actual source of the problem, not a convincing substitute for it. And what he documented across thousands of cases was a pattern that is almost universal. When the real source of a problem is too painful, too unclear, or too threatening to address directly, the mind finds a nearby problem. One that is visible, one that has a name, one that can actually be solved. And it pours all its energy there. Textopajon it out of weakness, not out of laziness, not out of any failure of character, out of protection. The brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, keeping you away from something it doesn't yet know how to face. And the decoy problem, the one you've been solving, feels completely real, because it is real. The relationship was difficult, the job was wrong, the city was suffocating. Those things were true, but they were also easier to see than what was underneath. And underneath is where the pattern actually lives. Stay with me here. I want to ask you something specific, and I want you to resist the urge to answer too quickly. Think about the last real change you made. Not a small adjustment, a real one. The kind that required courage, the kind people in your life noticed. How long did the relief last? Maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, if you're honest. And then, slowly, like a tide that doesn't announce itself, the familiar feeling returned. Not identical. New circumstances, new faces, new details, but underneath the same texture. And here's what neuroscience has confirmed about why this happens and why it isn't your fault. The emotional patterns a woman carries don't live in her circumstances. They live in her when you move cities. They pack themselves quietly into the same bags. When you leave relationships, they wait patiently for the next one. When you reinvent yourself on the outside, they sit inside unchanged, waiting to recognize themselves in the new life you've built. I know this from the inside, not as a concept. I spent years making changes that looked significant from the outside and feeling the same thing return from the inside. For a long time, I interpreted that as evidence that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I needed to change more, better, differently. What I hadn't understood yet was that I was rearranging furniture in a house whose foundation I had never examined. And the furniture can be perfect. The arrangement can be beautiful. The room can look exactly the way you imagined. And if the foundation underneath it is cracked, the feeling will keep returning, because the foundation doesn't care what the room looks like. This is what most advice misses entirely. It tells you to change the circumstances, change the relationship, change the job, change the habits, change the narrative you tell yourself. All of those things can be useful. None of them address the foundation. And the foundation, the deep, structural pattern that shapes every room you walk into, that requires a different kind of attention entirely. It requires you to stop looking at what is visible and start asking what is invisible. Not what needs to change around you, but what has been living inside you, quietly shaping every choice you've made. Stay with me, because this is where most women stop. Not because they don't want to go further, but because going further means acknowledging something uncomfortable, that the courage it took to make all those changes, real courage, genuine courage, was pointed at the decoy. And that is a painful thing to sit with. But sitting with it, really sitting with it, without rushing to the next change is the only way to something that actually holds. Here is what I've noticed about the women who finally stop running from room to room. They get quiet in a way that is different from exhaustion. It isn't the quiet of giving up. It's the quiet of someone who has just realized that the map they've been using was never drawn for the territory they were actually trying to navigate. And in that quiet, something becomes possible that wasn't before. Not a solution, not yet clarity. The kind that comes before solutions. the kind that makes solutions actually land. I'm not going to ask you to do anything tonight, because the doing has been the thing you've been reaching for all along, and it hasn't been the answer. What I'm going to ask is simpler and harder than that. Think about one change you've made in the last few years that you were certain would shift things. One of the real ones. And ask yourself honestly, with no judgment, what did you believe would be different after you made it? And then, was it not on the surface, underneath? Don't rush the answer. Don't explain it away. Don't reach for the next change. Just sit with what you find in that gap. Because what lives in that gap between what you hoped would change and what actually returned, that is the beginning of the real question. Not the decoy question. The one beneath it. Every woman who has ever felt the same feeling return after the bravest change of her life deserves to know this. You weren't solving the wrong problem because you failed. You were solving it because no one ever showed you where to look. If this reached you in some way, stay close. Subscribe. We're in this together.